Presenting Carole Spink, partner at McDermott Will Emery. Carole is an employment advisor on global and domestic employment law matters and is one of McDermott's COVID-19 employment task force leaders, advising clients on pandemic response and preparedness. Carole regularly speaks on employment matters and has published numerous articles on HR issues. Today, she will be speaking to us on the topic Perspectives on the Post-COVID Remote Workplace. Welcome, Carole.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Sorry for that technical difficulty real quick there. So thank you so much for joining. Today, during our short time together, we're going to talk about some best practices for employers when they're considering remote work. Is it our new normal? I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that, but what's certainly true is that more and more employers are having to use remote work arrangements more than any other time really in probably their history. And what employers are learning is that some of their prior assumptions about remote work really didn't come true during the early stages of the pandemic with the shutdowns and the quarantines. What a lot of employers are finding out is that in many circumstances, remote work worked fine. Employees were productive. Some employers have learned that employees were actually more productive. So what we recommend is that employers take a step back and really rethink those prior assumptions on the longer term feasibility of remote work. And certainly, unfortunately, I think this is going to be the way things are for a while now. I know that a lot of jurisdictions around the world are suffering from setbacks, particularly in Europe. I know India's had a lot of issues. Here in the US, we're seeing that in some states. So it's certainly, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So the goal for this presentation today is to arm you with some best practices as we continue to deal with the pandemic. So really quickly, there's some stats here, which I think are very interesting. First here, the McKinsey report on the 2020 Women in the Workplace study, which just came out last month, so end of last month. So this is very recent. 93% of companies surveyed say that more jobs can actually be done remotely, which to me was surprising. And 67% believe that a significant share of their workforce is probably going to be remote for the near future. PwC did a study earlier this summer with similarly high percentages. Interestingly enough, the 50% of employers expect that most employees will telework even after the pandemic has ended. Next slide, please. Here's another study by Gartner, found, again, high percentages of remote work, and also the European Union Commission telework policy brief states that nearly 40% of employees converted to telework during the pandemic. And this is in jurisdictions that some jurisdictions in Europe did not have as strict of policies on closure that others did. I know in Germany, a lot of businesses were open. So it's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see any updates to this now that we are continuing to go through the pandemic. So again, the goal for today is to arm you with some best practices for navigating this new normal. Next slide. So first and foremost, the legal landscape. What is absolutely clear is the laws are changing at rapid fire. Even now, 7, 8, 9 months along, we're still seeing new laws. We're still seeing updates to the CDC guidelines in the US. So the thing to note here is that just to understand, it is complicated and it's going to continue to change. And so, and this also addresses specifically laws that can affect the remote workplace. So as employers have more and more employees performing services remotely, that risk of not getting it right and keeping up with those legal obligations are going to rise similarly as well. So a couple, I listed some of the main ones that we're seeing right now on potential liability and questions that clients are coming to us and asking. first is wages hours. I mean, those are always complicated. And I'd say here, it's not so much that wage and hour laws are necessarily changing, but I think what's unique with remote work is how do you implement and follow those wage and hour requirements when your employees are all pretty much remote. It's very different from the time when employees would come to work 9 to 5 or 8 to 5. They have their break in the morning, their lunch hour, and then a break in the afternoon. How do you monitor that when people are at home? Parents are having to help with remote learning, all of these different challenges for the remote workplace. So we'll talk a little bit more about wages an hour in a few moments. But one area that we've seen a lot of change is leave laws. So here, and it makes sense, right? Because the point of the stay-at-home orders and the quarantines is to keep people out of the workplace that are either vulnerable or, more importantly, have or are suspected to have COVID. So we've seen a plethora of leave laws that have been implemented since the beginning of the pandemic, including in the US, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was unique, the first time that there was a federal paid leave law. It was limited in scope, but still, and that was directly reimbursable by the government to employers for employers but with less than 500 employees. So, and the leave laws could be paid, they could be unpaid, but the thing to keep in mind here is that you want to keep track of those laws because they're popping up all the time. Terminations and collective dismissals, here again, we saw a lot of movement here on unemployment changes in unemployment benefits. I know a lot of countries had specific unemployment schemes to address the fact that employees are not able to work if they're not able to work remotely, they're having to take leave because they have COVID or they have suspected to have COVID. So here, that we're definitely still seeing some of that in the United States. We had the CARES Act extra $600 amount that did go into, it ended in the end of July, but we expect that may come back, or some form of that may come back. It's been definitely talked about a lot. Occupational health and safety, that one is really hard for employers. I mean, particularly office work, there's occupational health and safety requirements, but most kind of traditional office workplaces haven't really had to deal with these types of legislation on health and safety, mask and PPE, and social distancing and limitations on numbers of individuals who can be in a small confined space, et cetera. It's a lot to keep track of. And here, what we advise is to just keep as up to speed as you can. If your jurisdiction follows, the WHO or the CDC, always go back to that because, for example, in the US, the CDC is very regularly updating their protocols on various issues. And so if you've dealt with a situation, say you have an employee that calls in and says that they have they're suspected to have COVID, all of the laws on who do I have to contact, do I have to do contact tracing, when can the employee return to work? All of those things are addressed in the CDC. And as the pandemic continues and we learn more, those regulations or those guidance are updated. So you'll definitely not want to necessarily rely on something that worked a month ago, because chances are there may have been some refinements to those protocols. And then, of course, you have possibly your national legislation, but then you probably have some kind of state or provincial legislation, and even possibly city legislation. So it's a lot to track, and you want to keep apprised of it. And here's one I think that we're going to see more of as the pandemic continues, is tax. And so this is contemplating the scenario where, employees, they're remote, they've been quarantined and they've been at home, but perhaps they decided to go to another state. And so they're working remotely, but they're not working remotely in the same jurisdiction, which is their regular workplace. All of those obligations on what withholdings do you have to make, because once this employee starts performing services on the ground in another state, more likely than not, or jurisdiction, it gets even more complicated if the employee has gone to another country. You really need to keep track of that and involve your tax and your legal to figure out, how you're going to keep up with that. Understanding where employees are actually performing services is going to be important. So next slide. So lots of movement on the legal front. And so the next thing we strongly recommend employers do, if you haven't done it already, is to go back and do some house cleaning on your policies. So what you're going to want to do is review your existing policies, your handbook, et cetera, and determine whether, given all of the legislation we just kind of went over, do we need to make amendments to our handbook and our policies, or do we actually need completely new policies? So that's something that, if it hasn't been done, you'll want to make sure that kind of put that on the to-do list. One thing that's I would go put in the category of potentially new policies is the remote work policy. So a lot of employers up to now didn't necessarily have a formal policy on teleworking. And now with the significant numbers that we saw of people that are working remotely, and it seemingly that this isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon, it might be that you want to start putting down into writing those policies on remote work. Another one is disciplinary policy. This is very difficult. We'll talk about this in a little bit on best practices with discipline, but it's, again, when the employees are all in the physical workplace, things like late, they're late, or they're not at their desk, or et cetera. Those things, you can see them, it's visible, so it's easier to enforce. But what do you do when the employee's, at home, and how do you enforce those policies? So taking stock of what you have in your disciplinary and your termination policy to make sure that you've accounted for this new remote work structure. Discrimination, harassment, and bullying policies. Here, it's not necessarily that you may even need to change your policies. I mean, you might if the policies don't contemplate or define the workplace broad enough to be someone's home when they're a teleworker. But one of the things that's really important here is that your supervisors and your managers, and of course your HR, are really up to speed on these type of legal issues, because one thing we're seeing absolutely right now is a significant increase in disability related claims in the US. So, when the person is unable to work because they have a serious health condition, and therefore they can't be in the workplace, so they have, a disability request, or they have an accommodation request. Those types of things you're just going to want to keep apprised of, and make sure that your supervisors and your managers are fully trained, and your employees are trained as well, to remind them. This one is a big one. Definitely go back and look at your confidentiality, proprietary information policies, your data protection policies, and your data security policies. I mean, hackers, it's been all throughout the news that hackers are just having a field day with hacking into system with so many people remote, without those, security that we have when we go into the workplace and we're on the quote network. People may be on unsecured networks, et cetera, or, understanding, one, do our policies cover us in all of the challenges now with the remote work situation? But also, are employees apprised of what they're supposed to be doing with these policies, or do we even have a policy? So it might be time to kind of freshen up those policies and have employees sign them and acknowledge them. And finally, timekeeping policies. This one, which will segue nice into our next topic, wage and hour. This one is very difficult. How, again, I gave the example of, what is late for work? What are the expectations if an employee is not responding to an email? Do they have child care responsibilities, or are they having to, get their kids signed up to Zoom to like have their school, those types of considerations, and how do you enforce those policies when you're not physically present, that the workforce is not physically present. So next slide. So one thing you definitely want to do is establish clear parameters to your workforce on the mutual understandings between the employer and the employee on what is expected of them in this remote work arrangement. So this is where you're going to want to make sure that employees are appropriately aware of what their hours are, what those expectations are with hours, what are their performance requirements, and this is for both the benefit of the employer, but also the employee. I mean, a lot of employees are understandably very stressed out with just the situation. And they're, probably a lot are wondering, well, gosh, how am I supposed to, get my work done when I'm at home and I have all these other challenges, or maybe the work is not, the business is not doing as well. Be very clear about performance obligations for the employer to be able to have appropriate performance, but also for the employee to make them feel comfortable in this new environment. When are they required to be available? For an employee that has primary responsibility for making sure that their child attends distance learning, by Zoom or whatever, what is the arrangement with that individual? Do they, is it expected that maybe they, log on a little earlier and then take care of that and then come back, or they work a little later? Just again, being very clear with employees so that there's no miscommunication. One thing you'll want to do, however, is make sure that what the documentation that you do provide confirms whether this is a temporary or a permanent situation. I think, going back to my original point that a lot of employers are rethinking remote work. And so, maybe there's the business decisions are made that some positions may just be appropriate to be remote work for the foreseeable future. Others, it might just be, again, just something that once the pandemic subsides, that you want employees back in the physical workplace. So being very careful with that, particularly outside the US, where once you confer a benefit, it is very difficult to unilaterally take it back. So you want that clear documentation to show that this is a temporary situation while the pandemic continues, that type of confirmation. Some jurisdictions may actually require that you prepare an actual amendment to the existing employment agreement itself. So again, in the US, we have the at-will rule. And so unless the employer has decided to provide employees with an employment agreement, it's generally at will. So, employers can make these changes fairly easily. Whereas in other jurisdictions, this would be a change to their terms and conditions of employment, an understandable change, certainly, particularly if the country is in lockdown. But you're going to want to make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's on any of those legal obligations. And if it's a country where you have to amend the existing employment agreement, particularly if the person's position is going to be more remote on a more permanent basis, you're going to want to amend the agreement. Some countries actually even require a specific amendment for home working or remote working situations. And there are even additional obligations such as occupational health and safety that go along with those home work arrangements. So you want to check the jurisdiction's laws. I mentioned this before, you'll want to definitely have employees either pre-acknowledge confidentiality and data security policies or have them sign new ones if they haven't signed them. You'll want to definitely address equipment for remote work. Here, this was a question we got a lot from employers in the beginning of the pandemic is, what do we have to provide employees? What don't we? And again, it's going to depend on the jurisdiction and the legal requirements, but also, taking stock of that from the employer's perspective and business. I mean, obviously you want to be able to provide employees with the necessary tools in order to succeed. And in some countries that may be an obligation for you to do that. So just making sure that there's an understanding of what equipment will and will not be reimbursed. And finally, this is, it's a stressful situation for sure. And I know that this is an issue that a lot of employers have in normal circumstances about documenting deficiencies, but you don't want to shy away from that during COVID, because if you're not consistent now, not picking one another, because then you can get into disparate impact claims, but wanting to understand that your managers and supervisors are trained on how to document deficiencies, because if you don't document them, then you're going to have a very uphill battle in trying to defend any type of disciplinary measures or termination that you take. We're seeing a lot of courts are extremely sympathetic to employees during COVID, which is understandable. So again, you want to make sure you have that documentation. And likewise with job descriptions, particularly if this is going to be a longer term, if the company's made a decision to make this longer term for a particular category of positions, you'll want to update those job descriptions. Next slide. So wage and hour. This is the one I think is going to probably be the most challenging. And, I guess here's some things to keep in mind. I think one of the areas where employers will get tripped up is the scenario I provided earlier about not knowing where your employees are. And, I'll pick on California, only because California in the United States has arguably the most employee-friendly laws, and they're very complicated and there's lots of them. If you have an employee that's in California, they normally work in, say, Arizona or a surrounding state, and they've now decided to quarantine in California. And you're not used to having employees in California, that can be an issue because you might be inadvertently violating a number of wage and hour laws that are applicable. So again, really understanding where people are and what the wage and hour and other legal requirements are in those jurisdictions, if it's different from the main work location. Some other challenges is ones I've already mentioned. How do you monitor work breaks? Particularly for overtime, for individuals that are entitled to overtime under local law. How are you going to track that? What's your procedures for requesting overtime? You want to be very specific with that. Otherwise, you're going to be in a situation where there's trouble. And certainly, wage and hour cases in the U.S. are not fun to defend. As the pandemic continues and you have more remote workforce, it might also be a time to consider investing in electronic timekeeping tools. There's a lot out there. So again, just kind of thinking big picture, how long is this going to continue? What can we do now that we're not in that physical work location? How do we manage all of our compliance obligations when employees are remote and not, coming to the workplace? Next slide. So here, I think the takeaway on this slide here is how you manage and discipline is communication. If you don't have good communication with your employees, this one's gonna be a problem. Employees, when everybody's remote, it's hard. It's almost like out of sight, out of mind sometimes, and employees can feel like they're kind of out in this island of their own and no one really is paying attention, which could be, for some employees, maybe they take advantage. For other employees, it may just be that they feel like, just completely on their own and not part of the team. So, stressing communication and figuring out regular protocols for communicating with the team is going to be absolutely critical for effective management and discipline. So some of the best practices here, I've provided some examples. Absolutely make sure your managers and supervisors are trained. A lot of managers and supervisors might not have ever had to manage employees that are not in the office that they can see and communicate with. And so training them on that, giving them the tools to succeed is really important. And likewise, employees understanding what their obligations are. If you're going to implement, an updated data security policy, training on those new policies, et cetera. Hopefully, or if you don't, you might now want to think of one, but a lot of employers implemented COVID policies, such as, if employees are going to come into the workplace, all the different rules that they need to follow. So making sure, again, that people have signed off and acknowledged these policies and they're adequately trained, and that your supervisors and your managers are adequately trained as well. And again, the regular contact, weekly Zoom meetings. For a while there, I can say I am on the COVID task force for my firm, and I was in charge of the Midwest for my team. And about a month into it, everyone was what we call zoomed out. I mean, it was like no more Zoom. Now we've gotten back to it again. So, maybe not weekly, but, you have to make that decision. I mean, but you got to start, putting something on the calendar and, making that a regular thing. Maybe it's bi-weekly, maybe it's not Zoom, maybe it's conference calls. Again, just thinking of ways that you can go ahead and move forward. But anyway, real quick, in the last slide, I know I'm out of time, and I'll be in the speaker lounge if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to chat, but just real quick, the next slide, and real quick, termination. So for termination, I'm going to leave you with some best practices here. How do you terminate people remotely? How do you make sure you get back company property? Always have a witness. That's best practice in normal circumstances, absolutely critical here in remote work. And again, involving your in-house legal or your external counsel as soon as possible, particularly if you have employees that are in different locations and you need to understand what the laws are in that location before you actually go forward with a termination. So with that, I think I'm out of time. But again, I will be in the speaker lounge if you have any questions. And you'll have materials. So I would just say good luck and thank you so much for attending, and have a lovely rest of the day and enjoy the rest of the program. Thank you.